If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider liking, sharing, and subscribing to the channel. Sharing it with your friends and family helps spread knowledge, and when we help others grow, we grow too. Thank you so much for listening. Let's dive into the podcast. Chapter 1, The Birth of an Heir, Ashoka's Early World, Part 1. In the shadow of the Mauryans, Ashoka's childhood and royal lineage. The year was around 304 BCE when a child was born into one of the most powerful families on Earth. Prince Ashoka entered a world already shaped by conquest and grand ambition. His grandfather, Chandragupta Maurya, had built an empire that stretched from the Arabian Sea to the Bay of Bengal. His father, Bindusara, ruled over 16 provinces and commanded armies that numbered in the hundreds of thousands. The palace where young Ashoka took his first steps buzzed with constant activity. Merchants from distant lands brought silk, spices, and precious stones through its gates. Court officials hurried between meetings, carrying scrolls that determined the fate of millions. Greek ambassadors spoke with Indian ministers in multiple languages, while spies whispered secrets in shadowy corners. This was the child's playground, a place where power flowed like a mighty river. Ashoka's education began early and was unlike anything most children could imagine. His tutors included some of the brightest minds of the age. Hindu scholars taught him the ancient texts and philosophy. Jain monks spoke of nonviolence and spiritual discipline. Greek teachers, remnants of Alexander's invasion, shared knowledge of mathematics and military strategy. Buddhist monks, though fewer in number, occasionally visited the court and left their mark on young minds. The empire itself was a teacher. Ashoka learned that power meant managing diversity on an enormous scale. His father's kingdom contained people who spoke dozens of languages, worshipped different gods, and followed various customs. The Mauryan system worked because it allowed local traditions to flourish while maintaining central control. This balance required constant attention and occasional force. Within the royal family, competition simmered beneath polite smiles. Bindusara had many wives and numerous sons. Each prince knew that only one could inherit the throne. Ashoka watched his older brothers, particularly Susima, position themselves for future power. He observed how courtiers shifted their loyalty based on who seemed most likely to succeed. Every gesture, every alliance, every friendship carried political weight. The administrative machinery of the empire fascinated the young prince. He saw how information traveled from remote villages to the capital through a network of officials and spies. Tax collectors, judges, and military commanders all reported to the center, creating a web of control that held the vast territory together. The sophistication of this system would later serve Ashoka well. Living in such an environment shaped Ashoka's character in profound ways. He learned to read people's motives, to spot deception, and to project strength even when uncertain. The constant exposure to court intrigue taught him that survival often required difficult choices. Trust was a luxury few princes could afford. As Ashoka grew older, the weight of his inheritance became clear. He was not just a prince, but a potential ruler of millions. The responsibility was enormous, and the path to power would demand everything he had learned in his privileged but perilous childhood. The seeds of both greatness and brutality were planted in those early years, waiting for the right moment to grow. Part 2, Brothers in Rivalry, the Struggle for Succession and Ascent to Power. When Emperor Bindusara died in 272 BCE, the Mauryan Empire faced its greatest test. The vast realm that stretched from Afghanistan to Bengal suddenly found itself without a clear ruler. Bindusara had many sons, but no official heir. The throne was up for grabs, and everyone knew it. Prince Susima, the eldest son, seemed the natural choice. Born to the first queen, he had spent years in the northern provinces, building relationships with powerful generals and wealthy merchants. The court nobles favored him. They saw him as steady, predictable, and unlikely to upset the existing order. Susima carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed the crown was already his. But Ashoka had other plans. Though younger and born to a queen of lower status, he possessed something his brother lacked: ruthless determination. While Susima played politics in the comfort of the palace, Ashoka had learned harder lessons. His years as a governor had taught him how to command loyalty through both fear and respect. The first moves came quietly. Ashoka began meeting secretly with military commanders who felt overlooked by Susima's circle. He promised them better positions, more land, and greater influence. These were practical men who cared less about royal bloodlines and more about which prince could secure their futures. Susima made a critical mistake. He underestimated his younger brother, dismissing him as too hot-headed and impulsive to pose a real threat. This blindness cost him dearly. While Susima focused on ceremonial duties and court appearances, Ashoka was building a shadow network of supporters throughout the empire. The breaking point came when fighting erupted in the capital. Supporters of both princes clashed in the streets of Pataliputra. Blood flowed in the royal quarter as brothers who had once played together now commanded armies against each other. The palace became a fortress, with different wings controlled by rival factions. Ashoka proved more willing to do whatever victory required. When generals hesitated to fully commit, he threatened their families. When provincial governors wavered, he promised them their enemies' lands. This was not the behavior of a refined prince, but of a man who understood that power meant nothing without the will to use it completely. The final confrontation was swift and brutal. Ashoka's forces surrounded Susima's stronghold within the palace complex. The siege lasted 3 days. When it ended, Susima was dead, along with most of his supporters. Ancient sources remain unclear about exactly how Susima died, but they agree on one thing. Ashoka left no rivals alive. The victory came at a terrible price. Ashoka had won the throne, but he had also learned that holding power sometimes required monstrous choices. The young man who emerged from this bloody struggle was harder, more suspicious, and far more willing to use violence as a tool of statecraft. These were lessons that would shape everything that followed. Part 3. The Making of a Prince, Governorship, Exile, and the Lessons of Ujjain. The palace corridors that had witnessed blood and betrayal now fell silent as Ashoka faced the weight of his victory. Within weeks of eliminating his brother Susima, the new emperor made a decision that surprised his courtiers. He would leave the capital and take up residence in Ujjain, one of the empire's most challenging provinces. What appeared to be a retreat was actually a calculated move to solidify his rule where it mattered most. Ujjain sat at the crossroads of ancient India's trade routes. Merchants from distant lands filled its markets with silk, spices, and precious stones. But prosperity brought problems. The city seethed with different communities, each with their own customs and gods. Hindu temples stood alongside Jain monasteries, while Buddhist monks wandered the streets seeking alms. Religious tensions flared regularly into violence that threatened trade and order. The young emperor arrived in Ujjain to find a province in chaos. Local governors had grown corrupt and distant from the people. Tax collectors demanded bribes, while roads fell into disrepair. Merchant guilds complained bitterly about theft and unsafe travel routes. Most troubling of all, several hill tribes had begun raiding settlements, testing the empire's resolve. Ashoka's first months proved humbling. His attempts to impose strict military control only sparked more unrest. When he ordered harsh punishments for religious violence, the different communities united against him. A major riot erupted after his soldiers arrested a popular local priest. For 3 days, Ujjain burned while Ashoka's forces struggled to restore order. The crisis forced him to reconsider his approach. Instead of ruling through fear alone, he began meeting with merchant leaders, religious teachers, and tribal chiefs. These conversations opened his eyes to perspectives he had never encountered in the palace. A Buddhist monk named Upagupta particularly impressed him with his calm wisdom and practical advice about governing diverse populations. Slowly, Ashoka learned to balance firmness with flexibility. He established regular courts where citizens could present grievances directly to him. He invested imperial funds in repairing roads and building rest houses for travelers. Most importantly, he created a council that included representatives from different religious communities to resolve disputes peacefully. The transformation didn't happen overnight. Several times, Ashoka's patience snapped, and he reverted to harsh measures. But each failure taught him valuable lessons about the limits of pure force. He discovered that lasting peace required more than just strong armies. It demanded understanding, compromise, and sometimes admitting when he was wrong. During his years in Ujjain, Ashoka also encountered ideas that would later reshape his entire worldview. Buddhist teachings about compassion and the suffering caused by violence began to resonate with him. Though he didn't immediately embrace them, the seeds of doubt about his own methods were planted during long conversations with monks and scholars. By the time he prepared to return to the capital, Ashoka had transformed from a ruthless prince into a more thoughtful ruler. He had learned to govern not just through power, but through persuasion and genuine concern for his subjects' welfare. These hard-won lessons in Ujjain would prove essential when he faced his greatest test, the conquest of Kalinga and its devastating aftermath. Part 4. Coronation Amidst Blood, the Civil War and Ashoka's Path to Emperor. When Bindusara breathed his last in 273 BCE, the Great Mauryan Empire faced its most dangerous moment. The emperor had ruled for 25 years, but he left behind no clear heir. Among his many sons, two stood out as the strongest contenders: Susima, the eldest and traditional favorite, and Ashoka, the battle-tested governor who had earned respect through his harsh but effective rule in Ujjain. The court split immediately. Ministers who valued tradition rallied behind Susima, believing the crown belonged to the firstborn. But Ashoka had spent years building his own network of supporters. The military commanders remembered his victories. The administrators recalled his decisive governance. Most importantly, his mother Subhadrangi and her family wielded considerable influence behind palace walls. Within days of Bindusara's death, both brothers began mobilizing their forces. Susima controlled the capital and the royal treasury, giving him an early advantage. He moved quickly to secure key positions and eliminate potential threats. But Ashoka had learned patience during his years in exile. Instead of rushing into open conflict, he quietly gathered his allies and waited for the right moment to strike. The civil war that followed was brutal beyond imagination. Brother fought brother while the empire watched in horror. Cities chose sides. Armies clashed across the subcontinent. Trade routes became battlefields. The very foundations that Chandragupta had built seemed ready to crumble under the weight of royal ambition. Ashoka proved himself a master of both warfare and politics. He struck deals with regional governors, promising them autonomy in exchange for their support. He convinced merchant guilds that his rule would bring stability and prosperity. Most crucially, he won over the military by demonstrating tactical brilliance in several key battles. The turning point came when Ashoka's forces surrounded the capital. Susima, trapped and outnumbered, made a desperate last stand. The final battle was swift but devastating. When the dust settled, Susima lay dead, along with dozens of other royal relatives who had opposed Ashoka's claim. Victory brought Ashoka the throne, but at a terrible cost. The new emperor ordered massive purges to eliminate any remaining threats. Brothers, cousins, and their supporters faced execution. Ancient sources speak of 99 brothers killed, though this number likely includes half-brothers and distant relatives. The palace halls ran with blood as Ashoka secured his position through terror. The psychological toll was immense. Years later, Ashoka would speak of deep regret about these early actions. The man who had learned compassion in Ujjain had been forced to abandon those lessons to survive. The contradiction between his growing spiritual awareness and the brutal necessities of power created a wound that would never fully heal. As Ashoka sat on his grandfather's throne, surrounded by the silence of eliminated enemies, he faced a harsh truth. He had won absolute power, but the methods required to claim it had changed him forever. The empire was his, but the cost would haunt every decision that followed. Part 5. The Empire's Ambitions, Early Policies and Growing Tensions on the Borders. The weight of absolute power settled over Ashoka like a heavy cloak. Within months of his coronation, the young emperor threw himself into the machinery of rule with fierce determination. The empire he had fought so brutally to claim now demanded his complete attention. Every decision carried the potential to strengthen or weaken the vast territories that stretched from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal. Ashoka surrounded himself with capable advisors, many inherited from his father's administration. These experienced ministers understood the delicate balance required to govern such diverse populations. They spoke of tax collection in distant provinces, of trade routes that needed protection, and of tribal chiefs who tested imperial authority. The emperor listened carefully, his mind processing each report like a military commander studying battlefield intelligence. The empire's infrastructure became Ashoka's obsession. Roads needed improvement to move armies and goods efficiently. Granaries required expansion to feed growing cities. Water systems demanded attention as populations swelled. Under his direction, teams of engineers and administrators fanned out across the subcontinent. They built roads that connected remote villages to major cities, creating arteries through which imperial power could flow. Trade flourished under these improvements. Merchants praised the safer passages and reliable way stations that sprouted along major routes. Caravans carried silk, spices, and precious stones to distant markets, filling the royal treasury with customs duties. The economic vitality strengthened Ashoka's grip on power while funding his ambitious projects. Yet prosperity brought its own challenges. Border regions remained restless, particularly along the eastern coast where the wealthy kingdom of Kalinga maintained its independence. Kalinga controlled crucial ports and trade routes, its merchants growing rich from commerce that bypassed Mauryan taxation. Their prosperity stood as a constant reminder of imperial limits, a territory that had successfully resisted Mauryan expansion for generations. Reports from the eastern frontier grew increasingly troubling. Kalinga's rulers displayed open defiance, refusing diplomatic overtures and strengthening their military positions. They formed alliances with other independent kingdoms, creating a network of resistance along the empire's most valuable coastline. Local Mauryan administrators complained of raids and border incidents that tested imperial patience. Ashoka's advisors presented him with stark choices. The empire could accept Kalinga's independence and the loss of revenue it represented, or it could take decisive action. The emperor studied maps showing Kalinga's strategic position, its wealthy cities, and its formidable defenses. His generals assured him that Mauryan forces could overcome any resistance, though they warned of significant costs. The emperor, who had learned the harsh lessons of civil war, found himself facing another military challenge. The methods that had secured his throne now seemed insufficient for the empire's future. As reports of Kalinga's growing strength reached the capital, Ashoka began planning what would become the most consequential campaign of his reign. Chapter 2: The Gathering Storm, The Road to Kalinga. Part 1: Between Empires, Kalinga's Defiance and Prosperity. Between the vast Mauryan Empire and the eastern coastline lay a kingdom that refused to bow. Kalinga stretched along the fertile shores where the Bay of Bengal met ancient trade routes. Ships from distant lands brought spices, silk, and precious stones to its bustling ports. The kingdom had grown wealthy from this maritime commerce, and its people took fierce pride in their independence. For generations, Kalinga had stood alone while mighty empires rose and fell around it. When Alexander's armies had swept across the northwest, Kalinga remained untouched. When Chandragupta Maurya built his empire, Kalinga held firm to its borders. The kingdom's rulers had learned that survival meant staying strong, staying united, and never giving ground to foreign powers. The Kalingan king ruled from a palace overlooking the sea, where merchant ships dotted the horizon like distant birds. His court buzzed with traders speaking different languages and carrying goods from across the known world. Gold flowed through the kingdom's treasury from taxes on this trade. The wealth allowed Kalinga to maintain powerful armies and strong fortifications along its borders. The kingdom's political system had evolved over centuries of independence. Local chiefs governed their regions but answered to the central crown. This balance gave people a voice while maintaining unity against outside threats. Kalingan society valued both individual freedom and collective strength. Warriors, merchants, and farmers all shared the same stubborn pride in their homeland. From his capital at Pataliputra, Emperor Ashoka watched Kalinga with growing concern. Here was a prosperous kingdom sitting astride crucial trade routes, openly defying Mauryan authority. Every day that Kalinga remained independent sent a message to other regions that the empire could be resisted. Ashoka's advisors whispered that such defiance made the emperor look weak. The economic temptation proved equally strong. Kalinga's ports generated enormous wealth that could fund further expansion. Control over these trade routes would give the Mauryans power over commerce flowing between North and South India. The kingdom's iron deposits and agricultural surplus added to its strategic value. But this was about more than money or strategy. Kalinga represented something dangerous to imperial thinking. It proved that people could govern themselves without bowing to a distant emperor. This example of successful independence threatened the very foundation of Mauryan rule. How could Ashoka claim divine authority to rule all of India while a prosperous kingdom flourished beyond his control? The two sides saw the world through completely different eyes. Ashoka believed in unity under imperial rule, where peace came through submission to central authority. The Kalingans believed in freedom, where peace came through strength and the right to choose their own path. As seasons passed, the tension grew heavier. Mauryan merchants reported increasing hostility in Kalingan ports. Border incidents became more frequent. Both kingdoms began eyeing each other's movements with suspicion. The collision between these opposing visions of how people should live seemed inevitable, like storm clouds gathering on a clear horizon. Part 2. The motivations of conquest. Economic, strategic, and political aims. The storm clouds gathering on the horizon carried more than just the threat of war. Within the marble halls of Pataliputra, Ashoka weighed the prize that Kalinga represented, and the calculation was staggering. This wasn't merely about conquest for glory. The young emperor saw opportunity wrapped in necessity, and the numbers told a compelling story. The coastal kingdom controlled trade routes that funneled wealth from across the seas into the subcontinent. Ships loaded with silk from distant lands, precious stones from Ceylon, and spices from southern kingdoms all passed through Kalingan ports. Every vessel that docked there instead of in Mauryan harbors meant gold flowing away from imperial coffers. Ashoka's advisors presented scrolls showing lost revenue that could fund entire military campaigns. The economic argument was clear. Kalinga's independence was expensive for everyone else, but money was only part of the equation. Military strategists unrolled maps across council tables, pointing to the dangerous gap in Mauryan territory. Kalinga sat like a dagger pointed at the empire's heart, splitting the northern territories from the southern conquests. Enemies could use this corridor to move armies, supplies, or messages without imperial oversight. Worse still, Kalinga's continued defiance encouraged other regions to question Mauryan authority. If one kingdom could remain free, why not others? The political pressure weighed heaviest of all. Ashoka had inherited an empire from his grandfather Chandragupta and father Bindusara, but inheritance meant little without proof of worthiness. Court whispers questioned whether the young ruler possessed the strength to match his predecessors. Regional governors watched for signs of weakness. Rival kingdoms tested border defenses, probing for cracks in imperial resolve. A successful conquest of Kalinga would silence these doubts permanently. The combination created perfect justification for war. Palace scribes could cite economic necessity when explaining the campaign to merchants. Military commanders could point to strategic imperatives when addressing the army. Political advisors could speak of imperial destiny when managing court opinion. Each argument reinforced the others, building an irresistible case for action. Ashoka found himself facing a decision that seemed to make itself. Every council meeting, every report from the frontier, every discussion with his advisors pointed toward the same conclusion. The empire needed Kalinga's wealth, required its strategic position, and demanded proof of imperial strength. Personal ambition merged seamlessly with state necessity. The emperor, who had once hesitated, now felt the weight of inevitability. Diplomatic solutions seemed increasingly hollow when the stakes were so high. The Kalingans had made their choice to remain independent. Now Ashoka would make his choice about what that independence would cost. The machinery of war began its slow, inexorable turn toward the coast, where a proud kingdom waited, unaware that its defiance had already sealed its fate. Part 3. Diplomacy fails. Ashoka's decision and Kalinga's stand. The drums of war were beating, but they had not yet drowned out the voices of reason. In the marble halls of Pataliputra, Ashoka's ministers prepared for one final attempt at peaceful resolution. The emperor himself understood that conquest through diplomacy would prove far more valuable than conquest through blood. A willing vassal served better than a devastated ruin. The first envoys arrived in Kalinga bearing scrolls sealed with the Mauryan lion. Their message was elegant in its simplicity. submit to imperial authority, accept Mauryan governance, and retain local customs under imperial oversight. In return, Kalinga would gain access to the vast trade networks that stretched from the Hindu Kush to the Bay of Bengal. The offer seemed generous to Mauryan eyes, but it landed like a stone in still water among the Kalingan court. King Anantavarman convened his council beneath the ancient banyan trees that had witnessed generations of free rulers. The merchants spoke of profitable trade relationships already flourishing with distant kingdoms. The priests reminded all present of their sacred duty to preserve the independence their ancestors had died defending. The generals counted their fortified positions and seasoned warriors. Every voice carried the same message. Kalinga had prospered without imperial protection and would continue to do so. The response that traveled back to Pataliputra was polite but unmistakable. Kalinga appreciated the emperor's concern, but required no external governance. Their kingdom had maintained peace, prosperity, and justice without imperial intervention. They proposed instead a treaty of mutual respect between equals, offering trade agreements and non-aggression pacts. This counter-proposal struck at the heart of imperial philosophy. Mauryan ideology could not accommodate the concept of equal kingdoms within the subcontinent. The empire was either expanding or contracting. There was no middle ground. Ashoka's second embassy carried a different tone. The scrolls now spoke of consequences rather than benefits. Defiance would bring isolation from imperial trade routes. Regional allies would be pressured to choose sides. Military demonstrations along Kalinga's borders would remind them of imperial power. Yet Kalinga's resolve only hardened. Each threat reinforced their conviction that submission would mean cultural extinction. They had watched other kingdoms lose their identity within the imperial system, their rulers reduced to appointed governors, their traditions subordinated to Mauryan law. The Kalingan court chose dignity over safety. The final ultimatum arrived with a 1,000-strong escort that camped outside Kalinga's capital. The message was stark: immediate submission or face the full might of the Mauryan military machine. The emperor's patience was exhausted. The kingdom had one moon's cycle to decide. Anantavarman's response came swiftly. Kalinga would defend its freedom regardless of cost. The diplomatic escorts were treated with respect, but told clearly that no further negotiations would be entertained. The kingdom began preparing for siege. As the last diplomatic mission departed Kalinga, both sides understood that words had failed, where force would now speak. The die was cast, and the coastal winds began carrying whispers of approaching armies. Part 4. Mobilizing for war, preparations, armies, and omens of catastrophe. The drums began beating in Pataliputra before dawn. Through the capital's wide streets, messengers carried sealed orders to barracks, supply depots, and military commanders. Ashoka had given his final command. The machinery of the Mauryan Empire would mobilize for its greatest campaign. Within days, the scale of preparation became clear. Blacksmiths worked through the night forging spear points and arrowheads. Granaries opened their stores as quartermasters calculated rations for tens of thousands of soldiers. Elephant trainers gathered their charges from across the empire, while cavalry units assembled from distant provinces. The capital buzzed with activity as supply trains formed and weapons were distributed. The emperor's war council met daily in the marble halls of the palace. Maps of Kalinga spread across tables as generals traced possible routes through dense forests and river valleys. The logistics were staggering. Moving an army of 100,000 men required careful planning of food supplies, water sources, and rest camps. Every detail mattered when marching toward a kingdom known for its fierce resistance. Strange omens troubled both sides as preparations intensified. In Pataliputra, priests reported that sacrificial fires burned with unusual colors. Birds flew in irregular patterns, and astrologers whispered of dark portents in the stars. Some courtiers spoke quietly of dreams filled with rivers of blood. Yet Ashoka pressed forward, declaring that destiny favored the righteous. Meanwhile, urgent preparations transformed Kalinga's landscape. King Anantavarman ordered every able-bodied man to join defensive preparations. Villages emptied as people moved to fortified towns. Ancient walls received new reinforcements, and fresh earthworks rose around strategic positions. Blacksmiths melted down farming tools to forge weapons for citizen soldiers. Kalinga's coastal ports buzzed with activity as ships carried messages to allied kingdoms seeking support. Women organized food supplies while children helped dig defensive trenches. The kingdom's famous independence became a rallying cry heard in every marketplace and temple. Stories of ancient heroes who had resisted invaders spread through the population, strengthening resolve. As both armies grew, the human cost became apparent. Families said tearful goodbyes as sons and fathers marched toward an uncertain fate. Villages watched their young men disappear down dusty roads. Mothers offered prayers at temples while wives clutched their children closer. The entire region held its breath. The gathering storm could be felt across the Indian subcontinent. Trade routes emptied as merchants avoided the coming battlefield. Neighboring kingdoms watched nervously, knowing that this conflict would reshape the balance of power forever. The coastal winds carried an electric tension that made even animals restless. By the full moon, massive armies faced each other across the forests separating Mauryan territory from Kalinga's borders. The die was cast, and the stage was set for a confrontation that would echo through history. The largest military force ever assembled in ancient India was about to collide with a kingdom determined to preserve its freedom at any cost. Chapter 3: The Crucible of Violence, Kalinga War and the Ashokan Transformation. Part 1: The Battle by the Daya River, Tactics, Carnage, and Civilian Tragedy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Daya River as two vast armies prepared for battle. Ashoka's forces, disciplined and battle-hardened, formed their lines with mechanical precision. War elephants trumpeted in the distance, while soldiers checked their weapons one final time. Across the river, the Kalinga warriors stood defiant, knowing their homeland depended on this single confrontation. The first charge shattered the morning calm. Mauryan cavalry thundered across shallow points of the river, while archers released volleys that darkened the sky. The Kalinga fighters, though outnumbered, fought with desperate courage. They knew every hill and valley, using the terrain to their advantage. But Ashoka's military machine had conquered most of India for good reason. The battle quickly turned savage. Elephants trampled fallen warriors while swords clashed in brutal hand-to-hand combat. The river itself became a barrier and a trap, as wounded soldiers fell into its waters and drowned. What began as organized warfare descended into chaos as both sides pressed forward with increasing violence. Then came the moment that would haunt Ashoka forever. As Mauryan forces broke through Kalinga defenses, the violence spilled beyond the battlefield. Fleeing soldiers sought refuge in nearby villages, but the pursuing army made no distinction between combatants and civilians. Women and children who had never held weapons fell under Mauryan's swords. Entire families were cut down as they tried to escape. The systematic destruction that followed revealed the true horror of ancient warfare. Villages burned while their inhabitants fled or died. Markets and temples, the heart of Kalinga civilization, were reduced to smoldering ruins. The elderly who could not run fast enough were killed where they stood. Children became orphans in moments, their cries echoing across the devastated landscape. Archaeological evidence suggests the scale of death was staggering. Mass graves from this period tell a story of unprecedented carnage. The Daya River, witnesses later claimed, ran red for 3 days. Bodies floated downstream for weeks, creating a grim reminder of the battle's cost. Even Ashoka's own soldiers were horrified by what they had done. These men, trained for conquest, found themselves questioning orders as they witnessed the suffering they had caused. Many would later speak of nightmares that followed them long after the fighting ended. The victory they had won felt hollow when measured against the human cost. The aftermath painted an even darker picture. Kalinga's sophisticated civilization, built over centuries, lay in ruins. Trade networks collapsed, leaving survivors without means to rebuild. Orphaned children wandered the countryside while widows searched desperately for missing family members. The very fabric of society had been torn apart. As reports reached Ashoka about the true extent of the destruction, something fundamental shifted within the emperor. The numbers were beyond anything he had imagined. This victory, achieved through such terrible means, would force him to confront the moral weight of his conquests and question everything he believed about power and kingship. Part 2: Edict 13, Ashoka's own words on the horror and suffering Kafan. The weight of victory had never felt heavier. In the days following the carnage at Kalinga, Ashoka retreated to his chambers, where scribes brought him detailed reports of the destruction. But these were not the usual accounts of territory gained or treasure seized. These were testimonies of human suffering on a scale that left even hardened generals speechless. What emerged from this period of reflection would become one of history's most remarkable documents. Carved into stone across his empire, Edict 13 stands as perhaps the first public confession of a conqueror's remorse. In his own words, Ashoka detailed not just the military victory, but the moral catastrophe that accompanied it. 150,000 people were deported, 100,000 were killed, and many more died from other causes. These numbers, etched in stone for all to see, revealed the true cost of his conquest. The emperor's words carried an unprecedented weight of personal responsibility. The beloved of the gods felt remorse, for when an independent country is conquered, the slaughter, death, and deportation of the people is extremely grievous and weighs heavily on the mind of the beloved of the gods. No ruler before had publicly acknowledged such anguish over victory. While other kings celebrated their triumphs with boastful inscriptions, Ashoka chose to expose his own spiritual wounds. The edict revealed something equally remarkable about the suffering of his own soldiers. Ashoka admitted that even the victorious Mauryan forces had been deeply affected by what they witnessed and participated in. The emperor recognized that violence corrupted not just the defeated, but also those who inflicted it. This insight would prove revolutionary in ancient thinking about warfare and power. What made these inscriptions truly extraordinary was their audience. Unlike private court documents or royal diaries, these words were carved in public spaces where common people could see them. Ashoka was not confessing to priests or advisors in private chambers. He was acknowledging his moral failure before his entire empire. This public display of vulnerability and remorse from an absolute ruler was virtually unheard of in the ancient world. The language itself was deliberate and personal. Ashoka did not hide behind abstract terms or diplomatic phrases. He used simple, direct words that conveyed genuine anguish. The repeated references to his own mental suffering showed a ruler grappling with the human cost of his ambitions. This was not political theater, but authentic moral crisis made public. These inscriptions would fundamentally change how power and righteousness were understood in ancient India. By admitting the moral bankruptcy of conquest through violence, Ashoka opened a new conversation about what it meant to rule justly. His words would inspire Buddhist thought for centuries and establish precedents for ethical governance that resonated far beyond his empire. The edicts marked the beginning of Ashoka's complete transformation from conqueror to moral leader, setting the stage for his adoption of Buddhist principles and his revolutionary approach to kingship based on Dharma rather than force. Part 3. The Aftermath. Kalinga annexed and the toll on victors and vanquished. The war was over, but the real horror was just beginning. Kalinga lay broken under Mauryan occupation, its cities smoldering ruins where once proud kingdoms had flourished. Ashoka's armies moved through the conquered territory like a plague, establishing administrative posts and collecting tribute from survivors who had lost everything. The emperor's officials arrived with scrolls and seals, transforming a free people into subjects of a distant throne. The psychological wounds cut deeper than physical destruction. Kalinga's warriors who had surrendered found themselves serving the very empire that had slaughtered their families. Children wandered the ruins searching for parents who would never return. Women became widows overnight, left to rebuild communities that had been systematically dismantled. The social fabric that had held Kalinga together for generations simply collapsed under the weight of trauma and foreign rule. Ashoka's own soldiers carried invisible scars back to their homes across the empire. Veterans spoke in hushed tones about rivers running red with blood, about the screams of civilians caught in the crossfire. Many could not sleep without hearing the cries of dying enemies. The victory celebrations in Pataliputra felt hollow when measured against memories of the battlefield carnage. The emperor himself began to change in ways that alarmed his court. Ashoka, once eager to hear reports of military triumphs, now listened to casualty figures with visible distress. He stopped attending the elaborate victory feasts that had once been his greatest pleasure. Palace servants noticed him walking the halls at night, unable to rest, his face bearing the weight of impossible questions. Letters from Kalinga painted a picture of devastating suffering. Entire bloodlines had been wiped out. Villages stood empty, their populations either dead or fled. The fertile lands that had made Kalinga prosperous now produced meager harvests worked by broken people under foreign oversight. Famine threatened regions that had never known hunger. Court advisors urged Ashoka to celebrate his expanded empire, but their words rang false against the reality of what expansion had cost. The gold flowing into Mauryan treasuries was stained with innocent blood. Every tribute payment represented families torn apart, communities destroyed, and futures stolen from an entire generation of Kalingan children. Something fundamental shifted in Ashoka's understanding of power during these dark months. Victory no longer felt like triumph when measured against such enormous human suffering. The emperor who had once gloried in conquest now questioned whether any territorial gain could justify such widespread misery. His generals noticed him studying Buddhist texts, seeking answers that military strategy could never provide. The transformation happening within Ashoka would soon reshape the entire nature of his rule. The horror he witnessed in Kalinga's aftermath planted seeds of doubt that would blossom into a completely new philosophy of kingship. The conqueror was dying inside the emperor, making room for something unprecedented in the ancient world. Part 4: The Emperor's Remorse. A crisis of conscience and the seeds of change. The imperial palace felt different now. Where once Ashoka had walked with confidence through marble halls adorned with tribute from conquered lands, he now moved like a man haunted. The golden ornaments and silk tapestries that decorated his chambers reminded him not of glory, but of the price paid for each treasure. Sleep came rarely, and when it did, dreams filled with the screams of Kalinga's dying echoed through his rest. Court sessions that had once energized the emperor now felt unbearable. Ministers arrived with reports of tax collection and military preparations, speaking in the same measured tones they had always used. But Ashoka could barely focus on their words. When they spoke of expanding trade routes or strengthening border defenses, all he could think about were the families destroyed to make such prosperity possible. He began canceling audiences, retreating to private chambers where servants found him staring at walls for hours. The transformation was visible to everyone around him. His appetite vanished, leaving elaborate royal meals untouched. The emperor, who had once enjoyed wrestling matches and hunting expeditions, now refused all entertainment. His closest advisors whispered among themselves, wondering if grief had damaged their ruler's mind. Some feared he was becoming weak, unfit to lead an empire that stretched across most of the known world. During these isolated months, Ashoka encountered ideas that had always existed around him, but never demanded his attention. Buddhist monks had lived in his territories for decades, teaching about suffering and compassion to anyone who would listen. Now, in his darkest hour, their words reached him differently. A monk named Upagupta visited the palace, speaking quietly about the cycle of violence and the possibility of ruling through moral example rather than force. These conversations challenged everything Ashoka had believed about kingship. His grandfather Chandragupta had built the empire through conquest. His father had maintained it through strength. Both had taught him that power came from the ability to destroy enemies completely. Yet here was an alternative vision. A king who protected rather than conquered, who served his people rather than demanding their service. The emperor began reading Buddhist texts with the same intensity he had once studied military strategy. The concept of ahimsa, or nonviolence, struck him as revolutionary yet logical. If causing suffering was wrong for ordinary people, why should it be different for kings? If compassion made individuals better, could it also make empires better? This internal struggle created a crisis that went beyond personal guilt. Ashoka realized that his entire approach to governance had been built on assumptions he could no longer accept. The question was not just how to find peace with his past actions, but how to rule differently going forward. The emperor, who had once defined himself through victory, now faced the challenge of redefining himself through service. Chapter 4, The Path of Dharma, Ashoka's Conversion and Reign of Compassion. Part 1, A Gradual Awakening, Meditation, Healing, and the Influence of the Sangha. After witnessing the devastation at Kalinga, Ashoka found himself trapped in sleepless nights filled with haunting images. The emperor who once commanded with absolute authority now wandered his palace corridors like a lost soul. Palace servants noticed how their ruler had grown thin and distant, often staring at walls for hours without speaking. During these dark months, Buddhist monks began appearing at the royal court. They came not as petitioners seeking favor, but as quiet observers offering simple teachings. These saffron-robed figures moved through the palace with a peace that fascinated the tormented emperor. Their calm presence stood in sharp contrast to the courtiers who constantly demanded decisions about trade routes, military campaigns, and territorial disputes. One monk in particular caught Ashoka's attention. Upagupta was known throughout the region for his wisdom and gentle manner. Unlike other religious teachers who spoke in complex riddles, Upagupta used simple stories that even children could understand. When Ashoka first met him, the monk did not bow or offer flattery. Instead, he looked directly into the emperor's eyes and asked, "What brings you suffering?" This direct question opened something within Ashoka that had been sealed shut since Kalinga. For the first time since the war, the emperor began to speak honestly about the weight he carried. Night after night, Upagupta would sit with Ashoka in the palace gardens, teaching him meditation techniques that quieted the chaos in his mind. The meditation practice was difficult at first. Ashoka's mind raced with military strategies, administrative problems, and memories of battle. But gradually, as weeks turned to months, he learned to find moments of stillness. In these quiet spaces, he began to understand the Buddhist teaching that all living beings suffer, and that causing additional suffering only creates more pain. Other monks joined these evening sessions, sharing stories from Buddhist teachings. They spoke of kings who had chosen compassion over conquest, of warriors who had laid down their weapons to serve others. These tales resonated deeply with Ashoka's growing desire to find meaning beyond military victory. The transformation was not sudden or dramatic. Palace officials noticed small changes first. The emperor stopped demanding immediate execution of criminals. He began asking detailed questions about the welfare of his subjects. When reports arrived about distant provinces, Ashoka wanted to know about famines and floods, not just tax collection. As months passed, the healing process strengthened Ashoka's resolve to change course entirely. The Buddhism he was learning offered a practical path forward, not just personal peace, but a way to govern that aligned with his growing conscience. The emperor, who had once ruled through fear, was slowly becoming someone who wanted to rule through wisdom and care for his people. Part 2. Choosing Buddhism, Personal Struggle and Public Declaration. The moment of final decision did not arrive like a thunderclap. Instead, it crept upon Ashoka like dawn breaking over the Ganges, slow but unstoppable. After months of meditation and learning, the emperor faced a choice that would define not just his reign, but the very nature of kingship itself. His court watched with growing unease as their sovereign spent more time with Buddhist monks than military advisors. Whispers filled the palace corridors. Some ministers worried that their warrior emperor was becoming weak. Others questioned whether this spiritual journey was merely another phase that would pass like a monsoon season. The royal family felt the tension most acutely, watching Ashoka wrestle with doubts that seemed to age him before their eyes. The emperor's internal battle raged for weeks. In his private chambers, he would pace endlessly, weighing the demands of empire against the pull of his conscience. Could a ruler truly govern by Buddhist principles? Would showing mercy invite rebellion? Would nonviolence make the empire vulnerable to enemies who respected only strength? These questions tormented him through sleepless nights, creating a crisis that touched every aspect of his identity as both man and monarch. The breakthrough came during a particularly difficult meditation session. Palace records suggest that Ashoka experienced what he later described as a moment of perfect clarity. The weight of Kalinga's dead, which had pressed upon his heart for so long, suddenly transformed from burden into purpose. He understood that his suffering could become the foundation for preventing others from experiencing similar pain. The emperor who had once spread fear would now spread compassion. The public declaration changed everything. Standing before his assembled court, Ashoka announced his conversion to Buddhism with a voice that carried across the great hall like thunder. He spoke of Dharma, of righteous rule, of governing through moral example rather than brutal force. The stunned silence that followed revealed the magnitude of this moment. Never before had an emperor of such power publicly subordinated his authority to spiritual principles. The edicts that followed this declaration became monuments to a revolutionary idea. Carved into stone pillars and rock faces across the empire, these proclamations announced a new kind of rulership. Ashoka declared his commitment to nonviolence, religious tolerance, and the welfare of all living beings. He established the position of Dharma ministers, officials whose sole purpose was ensuring moral governance throughout his territories. This transformation created ripples that extended far beyond palace walls. Ashoka's conversion demonstrated that absolute power could be tempered by absolute conscience. His public embrace of Buddhist principles offered a radical alternative to traditional kingship, one based on service rather than domination, compassion rather than conquest. The emperor had not simply adopted a new religion, but had fundamentally redefined what it meant to rule. As news of the emperor's conversion spread throughout the empire and beyond its borders, Ashoka began planning even more ambitious projects. His newfound faith demanded action, and he was prepared to reshape his entire kingdom according to Buddhist principles of universal welfare and justice. Part 3. Laws of Piety, Edicts, Welfare Programs, and the Moral Revolution. The transformation of Ashoka's heart demanded the transformation of his empire. Within months of his public conversion, stone carvers across the realm began etching new messages into rocks and pillars. These edicts carried words never before spoken by a king. Where previous rulers had boasted of conquests and tributes, Ashoka proclaimed his commitment to compassion and nonviolence. The emperor's scribes worked tirelessly to translate his moral vision into practical law. Edicts appeared in local languages throughout the empire, ensuring that farmers in remote villages could understand the same principles that guided palace officials. The messages were simple, yet revolutionary. Treat all beings with kindness, respect other religions, speak truthfully, and care for the elderly and poor. Ashoka's reforms extended far beyond carved words on stone. Teams of workers began constructing hospitals in major cities, the first state-sponsored medical facilities in recorded history. These institutions treated both humans and animals, reflecting the Buddhist principle that all life deserved compassion. Alongside the hospitals, rest houses appeared along major trade routes, offering free shelter and food to weary travelers regardless of their social status or wealth. The emperor established schools and appointed teachers to spread literacy throughout his domain. Education, once reserved for the wealthy and privileged classes, became accessible to common people. These schools taught practical skills alongside moral instruction, creating a generation of citizens who understood both governance and ethics. To oversee this moral revolution, Ashoka created an entirely new class of government officials called Dharma ministers. These officers traveled throughout the empire, ensuring that local administrators followed the new ethical guidelines. They investigated complaints of injustice, mediated disputes peacefully, and reported directly to the emperor. For the first time in history, a ruler had institutionalized morality as a function of government. The changes reached even the royal kitchens. Ashoka banned animal sacrifices at court ceremonies and drastically reduced meat consumption in the palace. Royal hunting expeditions, once grand displays of imperial power, were replaced with pilgrimages to Buddhist holy sites. The emperor's personal example set new standards for behavior throughout the administrative hierarchy. These sweeping reforms faced resistance from traditional nobles and priests who saw their influence diminishing. Some provincial governors struggled to implement policies that seemed to contradict centuries of established practice. Yet Ashoka persisted, using his network of spies and administrators to monitor compliance and adjust policies when necessary. The emperor's moral experiment created the world's first systematically ethical state. Roads improved not for military conquest, but for pilgrimage and trade. Laws protected the weak rather than merely serving the powerful. Government resources flowed toward healing and education rather than weapons and monuments to royal glory. As these transformations took root across the empire, Ashoka began contemplating an even grander vision. His reformed kingdom could serve as a model for neighboring lands, spreading Buddhist principles beyond his borders through diplomacy rather than warfare. Part 4. The Dharma Raja, instituting nonviolence, justice, and universal welfare. The vision of spreading Buddhist principles beyond his borders required Ashoka to first perfect their application within his own realm. The emperor understood that true transformation demanded more than proclamations carved in stone. It needed living examples of compassion woven into the daily fabric of governance. The prohibition of animal sacrifices marked the most visible break with tradition. For centuries, ritual slaughter had accompanied royal ceremonies and religious festivals. Ashoka banned these practices outright, replacing them with offerings of flowers, incense, and food. Temple priests initially resisted, arguing that the gods demanded blood. The emperor responded by redirecting temple resources toward feeding the poor and caring for the sick. When people saw hospitals rise where altars once ran red, many began to accept this gentler form of worship. Creating the Dharma Mahamatras represented Ashoka's most innovative administrative reform. These officers of morality served as traveling judges, mediators, and social workers combined. Unlike traditional magistrates who enforced laws through punishment, they sought to resolve disputes through dialogue and understanding. A merchant cheated by a partner might expect harsh penalties under old laws. Instead, a Dharma Mahamatra would bring both parties together, seek the root of their conflict, and guide them toward reconciliation that preserved relationships and dignity. The administrative elite watched these changes with mixed feelings. Senior officials who had built careers on rigid hierarchy found themselves expected to show compassion to subordinates. Military commanders accustomed to solving problems through force now received orders to exhaust peaceful options first. Some embraced the new approach, discovering that kindness often achieved better results than intimidation. Others grumbled privately while complying publicly, understanding that Ashoka's commitment ran too deep to challenge directly. Justice transformed from punishment to rehabilitation. Courts began considering the circumstances behind crimes rather than simply matching offenses to penalties. A farmer who stole grain during drought might receive seeds and tools instead of imprisonment. A young man who fought in anger might serve in a hospital rather than face flogging. These approaches required more time and resources than traditional justice, but they produced citizens who contributed to society rather than nursing grievances against it. Religious tolerance became another pillar of Ashoka's moral state. The emperor encouraged debate between different faiths while forbidding persecution of any group. Buddhist monasteries received royal patronage, but so did Hindu temples, Jain communities, and other religious traditions. This policy created unprecedented harmony among diverse populations who had often viewed each other with suspicion. The ripple effects of these reforms reached every corner of society. Villages that had feuded for generations learned to settle disputes through mediation. Traders discovered that honest dealing brought more profit than cheating. Children grew up expecting kindness from authority figures rather than fearing them. As these transformations deepened, Ashoka began to envision extending this moral revolution beyond his empire's borders. His own children would soon become the instruments of this grander ambition. Part 5. Family as messengers, sending Mahinda and Sanghamitta to distant lands. The emperor who had transformed his vast empire now turned his attention to a mission that would extend far beyond his borders. Ashoka's children, Mahinda and Sanghamitta, had grown up witnessing their father's remarkable transformation from a ruthless conqueror to a compassionate ruler. They had seen firsthand how Buddhist teachings could change not just individual hearts but entire societies. Now their father asked them to carry this transformative message to distant lands. Prince Mahinda, trained in both statecraft and Buddhist philosophy, possessed the perfect combination of royal authority and spiritual wisdom needed for such a delicate mission. His sister Sanghamitta had devoted herself to the Buddhist order as a nun, bringing deep religious knowledge and the respect that came with such dedication. Together, they represented both the temporal and spiritual power of their father's reformed empire. The legendary journey to Sri Lanka became the most celebrated of these missions. King Devanampiya Tissa of Sri Lanka had already established diplomatic relations with Ashoka, but the arrival of the emperor's own children transformed a political relationship into something far more profound. Mahinda didn't arrive as a conqueror or even as a simple ambassador. He came as a teacher, carrying scrolls of Buddhist texts and the living example of dharmic governance. The meeting between Mahinda and the Sri Lankan king took place in the hills outside the capital, where Tissa was hunting. Rather than immediately revealing his identity, Mahinda engaged the king in philosophical discussion, testing his wisdom and readiness to receive Buddhist teachings. This gentle approach reflected Ashoka's understanding that spiritual transformation couldn't be forced, only offered to those prepared to receive it. Sanghamitta's mission proved equally significant. She brought with her a cutting from the sacred Bodhi tree under which Buddha had achieved enlightenment. This wasn't merely a symbolic gift, but a living connection to Buddhism's origins. The tree she planted in Sri Lanka still grows today, making it possibly the oldest historically documented tree in the world. Her establishment of the first order of Buddhist nuns in Sri Lanka ensured that women could fully participate in the religious life of the island. These missions succeeded where military conquest might have failed. The Buddhist teachings took root naturally in Sri Lankan soil because they came through family bonds and genuine spiritual sharing rather than imperial decree. The conversion of Sri Lanka's royal family created a ripple effect throughout the population, establishing Buddhism as the island's dominant religion for over 2 millennia. The success of these family missions revealed Ashoka's sophisticated understanding of how ideas spread. Military force could conquer territories, but only genuine conviction could transform cultures. By sending his beloved children as messengers, Ashoka demonstrated his complete commitment to Buddhist principles, while ensuring that distant rulers would receive his emissaries with the respect due to imperial family members. These missions marked a new chapter in world history, establishing the precedent for spreading religious and philosophical ideas through peaceful means rather than conquest. The seeds planted by Mahinda and Sanghamitta would soon inspire similar missions throughout Asia, carrying Buddhist teachings from the mountains of Tibet to the islands of Southeast Asia. Chapter 5. The Wheel Turns: Ashoka and the Spread of Buddhism. Beyond Borders. Part 1. Pillars Across the Empire. Messages etched in stone. The emperor stood in his palace courtyard, watching as craftsmen chiseled the final words into a towering sandstone pillar. Ashoka had discovered something powerful after his transformation following the Kalinga War. Words carved in stone could speak to thousands of people across his vast empire, carrying his message long after he was gone. The challenge was enormous. His empire stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan to the tropical coasts of southern India. People spoke different languages, followed different customs, and worshipped different gods. How could one ruler communicate with such diversity? Ashoka found his answer in stone. He ordered the creation of edicts carved into rocks and mounted on polished pillars throughout his territory. These weren't simple royal announcements. They were carefully crafted messages that spoke directly to his people about how to live good lives. The emperor chose his words with the precision of a poet and the wisdom of a teacher. In the north, where Greek influence remained strong from Alexander's conquest, Ashoka's messages appeared in Greek script. In the west, he used Aramaic, the language of trade and diplomacy. Across most of his empire, he employed Prakrit, the common language people actually spoke, rather than the formal Sanskrit of the elite. Each inscription was tailored to its audience, showing respect for local culture while promoting universal values. The content of these stone messages revealed Ashoka's revolutionary approach to kingship. Instead of boasting about military victories or demanding tribute, he spoke about compassion, honesty, and respect for all living beings. He advised parents on raising children, urged traders to deal fairly, and reminded officials to serve with integrity. One edict proclaimed that all people were his children, and like a father, he wanted only their happiness and welfare. The pillars themselves became works of art. Craftsmen polished the sandstone until it gleamed like mirrors. They topped many with animal sculptures, lions and elephants carved with exquisite detail. The famous lion capital from Sarnath, with 4 lions standing back to back, became a symbol of strength and righteousness that would endure for centuries. These monuments appeared in bustling market towns, along major trade routes, and at important religious sites. Travelers would stop to read the emperor's words, merchants would discuss them over meals, and local officials would refer to them when making decisions. The inscriptions created a shared vocabulary of ethics across the empire's diverse population. Some edicts addressed specific problems. When Ashoka learned that court officials were interrupting his meetings unnecessarily, he carved instructions about when he should and shouldn't be disturbed. When he wanted to regulate animal sacrifice, he listed which creatures should be protected. These personal touches made the distant emperor feel present and accessible. The stone messages represented more than communication. They were Ashoka's attempt to create lasting change in how people thought about power, responsibility, and human relationships. By carving his ideals in permanent stone, he hoped to influence not just his contemporaries, but future generations. This ambitious project would soon extend beyond his empire's borders, as Ashoka prepared to send his message of compassion to distant lands and foreign rulers. Part 2. Missions to the World, Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and the Hellenistic West. With his empire now connected through stone messages, Ashoka turned his vision outward. The emperor who had once conquered through war now sought to conquer hearts across distant lands. His tool would not be armies, but something far more revolutionary: the peaceful spread of Buddhist teachings through carefully chosen ambassadors and monks. The first great success came closest to home. Ashoka sent his own son, Mahinda, and daughter, Sanghamitta, to the island kingdom of Sri Lanka. King Devanampiya Tissa ruled there, and the royal family of Ceylon proved remarkably receptive to Buddhism. When Mahinda arrived and began teaching, the king himself converted. This wasn't just a political alliance. It became a genuine transformation of an entire society. Sanghamitta brought something even more precious than teachings. She carried a cutting from the original Bodhi tree under which Buddha had gained enlightenment. This sacred sapling was planted in Sri Lanka, creating a physical link between the birthplace of Buddhism and its new home. The tree took root and flourished just as the religion did. Within decades, Sri Lanka became a Buddhist stronghold that would preserve the faith for over 2,000 years. Ashoka's ambassadors traveled much farther north, following trade routes into Central Asia. Here, Greek kingdoms established by Alexander's successors still ruled. The cultural mixing was extraordinary. Greek art styles blended with Buddhist themes, creating sculptures that showed Buddha with Mediterranean features. Archaeological evidence suggests Buddhist communities took hold in places like Bactria and Gandhara, regions that would later become crucial stopping points for monks traveling the Silk Road. The most ambitious missions headed west toward the Mediterranean world. Ashoka's own edicts mention sending envoys to specific Greek rulers, Antiochus of Syria, Ptolemy of Egypt, and others. Whether these kings actually converted remains unclear, but the fact that Ashoka attempted such outreach shows his remarkable vision. He imagined a world where different cultures could share spiritual insights across vast distances. These missions represented something unprecedented in human history. No ruler before Ashoka had systematically tried to spread religious ideas through peaceful persuasion across multiple continents. He was creating the world's first international network of spiritual exchange, connecting India with Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and the Hellenistic kingdoms through shared values rather than shared rulers. The success varied dramatically by region. Sri Lanka embraced Buddhism completely and permanently. Central Asian kingdoms adopted it selectively, blending it with local traditions. The Greek territories remained largely unaffected, though individual communities may have formed. Yet even partial success was extraordinary for an age when most international contact meant trade or war. Ashoka had transformed himself from a conqueror of territories into a missionary of ideas. His stone pillars had prepared his own people for this new vision of leadership. Now he was testing whether that vision could cross cultural boundaries and take root in foreign soil. The results would shape not just Buddhism's future, but the very concept of how spiritual movements could spread across the ancient world. Part 3. Guarding the Faith, Buddhist Counsels and the Preservation of the Dharma. Success across distant lands brought Ashoka face to face with a troubling reality at home. Buddhism was splitting apart. Different groups of monks taught different versions of the Buddha's words. Some claimed special knowledge that others rejected. Regional communities developed their own practices. The very success that had spread Buddhism far and wide now threatened to tear it into countless fragments. The disputes weren't just academic debates between learned monks. They cut to the heart of what Buddhism meant. Some groups insisted on strict interpretations of ancient rules. Others welcomed new ideas and practices. Local communities mixed Buddhist teachings with older beliefs. Without clear guidance, each monastery risked becoming its own separate religion. Ashoka watched these divisions with growing alarm. He had spent years promoting Buddhism as a unifying force for his empire. Now that same faith was becoming a source of confusion and conflict. If Buddhism couldn't maintain its own unity, how could it serve as the moral foundation for his diverse kingdom? The emperor decided to act decisively. He called for the Third Buddhist Council to meet in his capital city of Pataliputra. This wasn't just another religious gathering. Ashoka brought together the most respected monks from across his empire and beyond. He provided resources, security, and his personal authority to ensure the council's success. The assembled monks faced an enormous task. They needed to sort through conflicting teachings and establish which ones truly represented the Buddha's original message. For months, they debated, compared texts, and examined different traditions. They questioned monks about their understanding of key concepts. They challenged interpretations that seemed to stray from core principles. The council's achievements transformed Buddhism forever. The monks compiled an official version of the Buddha's teachings, creating a standard that communities everywhere could follow. They clarified confusing points of doctrine. They established clear rules for monastic life. Most importantly, they defined what made someone a true Buddhist monk, effectively drawing boundaries around the faith. Ashoka didn't simply host this council and walk away. He used his imperial resources to spread its decisions throughout his territories. Copies of the standardized teachings were distributed to monasteries. The emperor's officials ensured that local communities received accurate information about the council's rulings. This wasn't just preservation of doctrine, it was active management of religious unity. The results reached far beyond India's borders. The standardized teachings traveled with Ashoka's missionaries to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and other distant lands. New Buddhist communities could now access reliable versions of core texts. The faith maintained consistency even as it adapted to different cultures and languages. Ashoka had accomplished something remarkable. Rather than letting success breed chaos, he had used his power to strengthen Buddhism's foundations. The Third Council created lasting structures that would help the faith survive political upheavals and geographical expansion. The emperor had proven that effective leadership could preserve spiritual movements without stifling their growth. This careful balance between unity and openness would define how Buddhism spread across Asia for centuries to come. Part 4. A Legacy of Kingship, Ashoka's Model and the Dharmaraja Ideal. The Third Council had preserved Buddhism's core teachings, but Ashoka's greatest achievement lay deeper than protecting doctrine. He had created something entirely new in the ancient world, a vision of kingship built on moral authority rather than pure power. This idea would outlive his empire and reshape how rulers across Asia understood their role. The concept emerged naturally from Ashoka's transformation. After witnessing the horror of Kalinga, he had discovered that true strength came not from conquest, but from righteousness. He called this ideal the Dharmaraja, the king of righteousness. Unlike traditional monarchs who ruled through fear and force, the Dharmaraja governed by example, treating subjects as children who needed guidance rather than enemies to be controlled. This model spread far beyond India's borders. Buddhist monks carried Ashoka's edicts and stories to distant lands, where local rulers encountered a radically different approach to power. In Sri Lanka, King Devanampiya Tissa embraced both Buddhism and Ashoka's governing philosophy, establishing a tradition of dharmic kingship that would persist for centuries. The island kingdom became a testing ground where Ashoka's ideals took root in fertile soil. Southeast Asian rulers found the Dharma concept equally compelling. In kingdoms across Burma, Cambodia, and Indonesia, monarchs adopted Ashoka's emphasis on moral leadership. They built temples instead of fortresses, promoted education over warfare, and measured success by their subjects' well-being rather than territorial expansion. The famous Angkor rulers specifically invoked Ashoka's memory, seeing themselves as continuation of his righteous tradition. Yet implementing such high ideals proved challenging. Many rulers discovered that moral authority alone could not solve practical problems. Economic pressures, external threats, and internal corruption tested the Dharma model repeatedly. Some kings found themselves caught between their ideals and harsh realities, forced to choose between righteousness and survival. The concept also faced periods of fierce backlash. Military elites often resented rulers who prioritized Dharma over conquest. Traditional power structures pushed back against kings who showed too much concern for common people. Some regions abandoned the model entirely, returning to more conventional forms of autocracy. Despite these challenges, the Dharma ideal never disappeared completely. It adapted and evolved, taking different forms in different cultures. Thai kings incorporated Buddhist principles while maintaining royal authority. Japanese emperors blended Dharmic concepts with Shinto traditions. Even in India, despite Buddhism's decline, the memory of righteous kingship influenced later rulers. Modern leaders continue grappling with Ashoka's vision. India's founding fathers explicitly invoked his legacy, placing his lion capital on the national flag and constitution. Contemporary politicians worldwide cite his example when advocating for ethical governance and social responsibility. The practical challenges remain unchanged. How does a leader balance moral ideals with political necessities? Can righteousness survive in a competitive world? Ashoka's model provides inspiration but no easy answers, leaving each generation to wrestle with the eternal tension between power and principle. Part 5. The Enduring Impact. The Decline, Memory, and Resurrection of the Ashokan Ideal. The great emperor's death around 232 BCE marked the beginning of the end for his vision. Within 50 years, the mighty Mauryan Empire began cracking apart like an ancient wall weathered by time. Ashoka's sons and grandsons lacked his wisdom and strength. They quarreled over territories, ignored the people's needs, and abandoned the Buddhist path their grandfather had walked so carefully. The empire that once stretched from Afghanistan to southern India slowly shrank. Regional governors declared independence. Foreign invaders pressed at the borders. By 885 BCE, the last Mauryan ruler fell to a military coup. The dynasty that had created India's first great empire vanished into history's shadows. Buddhism itself began fading from Indian soil. Hindu traditions, never fully displaced, gradually reclaimed their dominance. New rulers preferred older gods and customs. Buddhist monasteries lost royal support and popular appeal. The faith that Ashoka had spread across continents became a minority religion in its birthplace. Yet something remarkable happened. While Buddhism weakened in India, it flourished elsewhere. The seeds Ashoka had planted in Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and Southeast Asia grew into mighty trees. Buddhist monks in distant lands carefully preserved stories of the great Dharma king. They wrote chronicles that kept his memory alive when India itself had almost forgotten him. For over 1,000 years, Ashoka remained mostly unknown in his homeland. His stone pillars stood silent, their ancient script unreadable to later generations. Jungle vines covered his edicts. Local people created legends about the mysterious monuments, but lost the true story behind them. Then came an extraordinary rediscovery. British archaeologists in the 1800s began decoding Ashoka's inscriptions. James Prinsep cracked the Brahmi script in 1837, suddenly revealing the emperor's own words after centuries of silence. Each translation unveiled more of his remarkable story. The world gasped at finding history's first ruler to embrace nonviolence and religious tolerance. Modern India embraced Ashoka as a founding father. When independence came in 1947, leaders like Nehru saw him as the perfect symbol for their new nation. His lion capital became India's national emblem. His wheel appeared on the flag. The Constitution's opening pages featured his edicts about justice and compassion. Ashoka's influence extends far beyond India today. Buddhist nations from Sri Lanka to Japan honor him as Dharma's great protector. Political leaders worldwide invoke his example when speaking about ethical governance. His edicts about religious tolerance resonate in our diverse, connected world. Even secular thinkers find inspiration in his transformation from violent conqueror to peaceful ruler. The questions Ashoka wrestled with remain urgent today. How should power serve the powerless? Can nations be both strong and compassionate? His answers may not fit our times perfectly, but his struggle to balance might with morality continues, inspiring those who seek better ways to govern and live together.